knowing that you did your very best at the end of the day. Even if you lose, like for example, I'll go to a trial and I'll work hard and I'll put in 80 hours, to prepare for a case. And I'll go through a trial and I'll put on witnesses and we put on our best arguments. I'll make a great closing argument and then we'll lose, you know. But I think at the end of the day, knowing that you did your very best and you can, in your conscience, you can rest assured that, okay, I can see how the jury got it that way. I can see how a judge would rule against my client.
Welcome to the Verdict Signal podcast, where we feature how top attorneys help people make informed choices, avoid common mistakes, and move forward with confidence. Now, enjoy the show, and here's your host.
Daniel Gao here. I'm the host of Verdict Signal, and today we're expanding our conversations to the experts who protect what people build, their careers, families, and businesses. I have Greg Gibbons, who attended Southwestern University School of Law and received his Juris Doctor in 2000. He then practiced law in Los Angeles from 2001 until 2010, where he worked as an employment litigator, representing employers and employees in wrongful termination, discrimination, and wage and hour cases, including several class actions. In 2010, Greg moved to Colorado Springs and started Gibbons Law Firm. With more than 24 years of litigation experience, Greg is well known for representing employers and employees in federal and state courts and in claims before federal and state agencies. So Greg, welcome and glad to have you here.
Good morning. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for having me.
Yeah,
appreciate the opportunity.
This is gonna be awesome. So let's start kind of from the very top. How did you first get interested in the legal field?
My father was a lawyer. He practiced law in probate and estate planning. So I got to learn a little bit from him just how the law works. Back in his day, he practiced from 1965 to about 2000. Prior to that, he was in the FBI. So in those days, all FBI agents, all special agents needed a law degree. And so he went to Northwestern University Law School. He met the director, J. Edgar Hoover. They flew out all the agents back then, and he worked in the counterfeiting division in Los Angeles. So he would bring me to the office when I was a kid from time to time. I didn't know what he was doing. I was 7, 8 years old, but I loved riding the elevator up 36 floors up to his office in the old UCB building in downtown Los Angeles. But I think over the years in high school and then in college, and then trying to figure out what I want to do, because I didn't know I wanted to go to law school when I was in college. I knew I liked history. I knew I liked political science, but I didn't know that the law was calling me. And then after interviewing with different firms, investment firms and then marketing firms and then, small businesses, it just seemed to me that my skill set always veered back to practicing law. So I didn't know how to do that. And so right after school, I worked for a trust bank. I sold clothes at Nordstrom, on the side, and I made some decent money doing that. But during that time, the O.J. Simpson trials were going on, criminal and civil. And I decided, this is what I want to do. I want to go to law school. So I decided to go to law school, and I got accepted at Southwestern University School of Law. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Okay. And so what led you specifically into the employment side of law?
Very good question. So also kind of falling into it, not falling into law school, but falling into it in somewhat because they had job postings at UCLA, but also at Southwestern where I went to school. And an alum at Southwestern, his name was by the name of Keith Fink. He's actually an outstanding lawyer. He graduated Southwestern in 1989. And he had a posting. He needed attorneys to staff his office because he had just recently split with his partner. And I interviewed with him. It seemed to be a good fit. He wanted to bring me on, and I signed up with him and I began work before I passed the bar.
Okay. Now, Greg, what's one thing that you wish people knew or really understood about working with a lawyer?
I think people need to understand that it's a balance. Okay, because on the one hand, I get some people who think they know everything because they can AI everything these days, and it's just, they think they're amateur lawyers and they know better than me or anyone else, right? And there are other clients or potential clients who disappear and are completely disassociated from, what I want to do. Well, in order for me to help them, I need their involvement. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship in some ways. We're working together. I'm getting information from you. Like, for example, if someone was terminated from their job, I wasn't there. I don't know what occurred. You need to fill me in. But I don't want, clients, calling me 5 times a day as well.
Mhm.
So don't disappear for 3 months. Don't call me 5 times a day. Sometimes something in between where we can have like some happy medium.
Mhm.
But I think sometimes people get either intimidated by lawyers because, somehow that we are have an in, to behind the scenes or something like that, like the Wizard of Oz. But it's not the case. We're real people just like everybody else. Okay. Yes, law school is hard. Yes, it's time and money. And there are people that I've known who've gone to law school, didn't want to practice law. I can't comprehend that at all. If you're going to spend that time, if
Yeah.
you're going to spend that money, you should practice law. Don't do it on the side or something like that, or just because you want a law degree. Some people want to go into business and they want to be like a corporate counsel, or they want to do, have that law degree to advance, their career. I get that. But I like rolling up my sleeves. I like being in the trenches. I like being in court. And as someone who, as a kid, struggled with a stutter, that was very difficult for me early on. Even in high school, I kind of would come out now and then where I would, stutter. And the thought of public speaking was like a monumental task. Like I couldn't fathom just how am I going to get up there without sweating and without stumbling over my words.
Mhm.
And I learned through, just through practice and hard work how to, think on my feet, how to speak, how to, persuade an audience. And it is immensely fulfilling for me, immensely fulfilling. I love what I do every day. I get paid well for what I do. And I can't imagine doing anything else.
Okay, very well said. Now, I want to ask about what are some of the most common situations that clients come to you for? I kind of mentioned that you in your introduction, you like wrongful termination, discrimination, wage and hour cases, but I mean, I know there's a lot of different subsets, also like sexual harassment, and then so many
Sure.
other things. Like, what would you say is the most common situations that clients come to you for?
These days on both sides, I tend to, represent mostly employers now. I used to represent employees.
Hmm.
So it's probably like an 80-20 split nowadays.
Hmm.
Back, like say 12 years ago, it probably was a 60-40 split in favor of employees.
Hmm.
These days, retaliation's a big one. I
Hmm.
mean, juries understand it. People understand it. People understand, the playground scenario where someone throws a rock at you, you throw the rock back. That's retaliation.
Hmm.
If someone files a workers' comp claim, don't fire them. If someone's on, medical leave, don't fire them. If someone complains about harassment or about unequal treatment in the workplace, even if it doesn't arise to actual discrimination, don't take action against, don't demote them, don't reduce their pay, don't reassign them, don't terminate them. And I have this discussion with my clients all the time. And oftentimes it rings true or they understand, but sometimes, employment law, unlike every other field of law, except for maybe divorces or family law, it's very personal.
Hmm.
Someone gets fired, that's personal. They're spending 2/3 of their waking hours, or at least 1/3 of their waking hours at work.
Hmm.
And so getting fired is a big deal. They lose their livelihood, probably a loss of reputation, among other things. And so, people understand that people get exercised over the fact that they get fired and they feel it's retaliatory for something that they did. So I field a lot of calls on that. The other one is disability, accommodation. These days, everyone feels entitled. They have to work at home. No, that's not the case. I know they did it for a year and a half during the pandemic, but I mean, come on, if an employer requires you to come to work, you got to come to work, at least 2, 3 days a week. Now, I understand that some jobs don't require that you can work from home remotely, depending on the nature of the job and nature of the job duties and responsibilities.
Mhm.
Those are the ones I see the most. And then you'll get like, wage hour issues, pay transparency in Colorado here. And in California, there's like the paid family leave, paid, leave where you got to pay someone, 48 hours of um, paid time off, in a calendar year.
Mhm.
You accrue it, every 30 hours of work. Uh, but I think, we can talk about just, with the resources to go to. I think I worked at Jackson Lewis, and Jackson Lewis has a wonderful website about case law updates and, the federal trends and the state trends. And they really do a great job of tracking the individual states and what's going on with these different states. Now on the labor side, I'm not familiar with that as much. I've done some of it, Section 7, Section 8. But that you don't see that in Colorado just because, I don't do a lot of public sector work and most unions are in the public sector. Private sector is really not the case. But, generally, disability accommodations, wrongful termination, and, wage hour, and also retaliation. When I receive calls from potential clients about wrongful termination, a lot of what generates or employment lawsuits, is just a lack of communication.
Mhm.
So my first question to every single potential client is, well, did you talk to HR? And no, what are we talking about here? How am I? I'm not a super HR department. Don't expect me to wave a magic wand and make and solve the problem. You need to take affirmative steps. That's what's required in the handbook, in the employee handbook or policy manual,
Mhm.
to ameliorate the situation.
Mhm.
And if you don't, then the law, you cannot, avail yourself of the protections of law because you've not done what you need to do under the law in the first place.
Mhm.
So, and I tell my employer clients the same thing. I mean, has that individual, are they complaining to their coworkers about their pay? Well, certainly don't fire them because that's protected. You can talk about your pay to your coworkers. But, if there's an issue, address it, and don't ignore it. And I think some employers are getting better these days at addressing, employee related issues. You don't see these days, Daniel, like, bad sexual harassment, like I've had a couple horrible cases 20 years ago when I was working for, Keith Fink. But these days, especially in Colorado, you just don't see it. Employers are primarily savvy. They have policies in place. They have corrective, procedures, in place whereby to rectify the harassment. Because, if you don't do it, you're going to get hit and hit big.
Mhm.
There was I think a verdict I saw in New York where a woman, it was race discrimination, retaliation, harassment, where she received $11 million verdict. So that
Wow.
could, I mean, if that's on the extreme, on the far end of the spectrum, but
Yeah.
you get the point, where, and these days, in California, a lot of carriers, large insurance carriers, are reluctant to write policies or underwrite policies for employment, claims,
Mhm.
just because it's said that the payouts can be astronomical.
Mhm.
So, I mean, those are kind of like the trends that I see. There's like different nuances, Daniel, in the Colorado law. Like there's a Power Act, which revised the definition somewhat of, sexual harassment. It removes a severe and pervasive requirement. It has, specific rules on disclosures. Like it's a species out of Me Too. Harvey Weinstein, they had non-disclosure agreements with all his alleged, his victims, and they couldn't talk about it to the media because they're non-disclosure agreements, for fear of breaching that agreement.
Mhm.
But those are kind of some of the trends I see, and also obviously the large one is, and I'm not familiar with this, is AI.
Mhm.
and the trend of AI and how that affects the workplace. Certain states like California, New York, Illinois, maybe others have specific laws how AI, the use of AI and regulating the use of AI in the workplace, and whether you can fire someone because, hey, I have AI now and your job is not necessary anymore. So those are the kind of like general overview, Daniel, of the trends that I see, particularly in the last several years.
Okay. Now, for all these the kind of subsets of employment law, you mentioned retaliation or termination, disability accommodation. What would you say some of the biggest mistakes you see people making before they call a lawyer like yourself?
Well, yeah, that's a great question because I encourage my clients to call me, hey, we're thinking about firing someone, we're thinking about accommodating someone. What do you think? I'm happy to have step in
Mhm,
and help them prevent liability or some type of claim because invariably that does happen.
mhm,
I think it's with disabilities, it's making assumptions about what people can do and can't do and whether that accommodation is reasonable in the workplace.
mhm,
Um, the whole premise behind the Americans with Disabilities Act was to, uh, you know, obviate or, prevent stereotypical assumptions about, disabilities.
mhm,
And so, the point is that, okay, well, if someone can't walk or can't see or can't hear or whatever, we need to make accommodations for that individual so long as they can perform the essential functions of their job. When I go back to that essential functions, meaning yes, if you can work from home 2 days a week and take care of your kid or your father or mother and still perform your job, then that's an accommodation that's reasonable. And there's nuances on there's defenses like, does it constitute undue hardship or is it a direct threat, to individuals' medical conditions, things like that. But I really encourage my clients to say, listen, we want to implement this. Like I have like a HVAC client here in Colorado Springs, and they want to put employees on a commission they want to designate them as exempt under like a commissioned salesperson exemption, right? Well, let me what you know in a work week, how much do they work? In a work day, do they make 1.5 times the minimum wage? Number one, does 50 or more percent, more than 50% of their pay is primarily constitute commissions. Okay. And then, of course, there are retail service establishments. You have to meet all three criteria in order for that exemption, to apply. So, with accommodations and disability, to me, I see that employers just go ahead and will deny accommodation without, part of another issue with disabilities is that there's what's something called the interactive process, which is like a line of communication between the employer and the employee.
mhm,
And the employer has to be open to the employee's suggestions and not just shut them down. But the employee can't just simply dictate, what they think an accommodation can be. I mean, there's a give and take, a back and forth.
mhm,
And if the employer shuts down, the interactive process early, well, that could give rise to liability. And so I advise clients, listen, I mean, this is something that if you want to advise me, I'm not going to be the individual communicating with the employee. That's your job. That's HR or general counsel. But I will be behind the scenes in advising you about what I think would be the best practice. And some of it is, now if there's litigation, okay, that's where the spilled milk comes in. I like litigation. I take care of it. And oftentimes, most employment claims, Daniel, typically settle. You don't have because, I have clients that say, this is principled, this is extortion, someone's, shaking me down. I don't want to pay them 1 cent,
mhm,
and then they get my bill. They go, oh, I didn't realize this is expensive to defend something like this.
mhm,
And I tell them, like, listen, in my book, 10,000 to settle is a lot less than 100,000 it would take to try this, try a case, take it all the way to trial,
mhm,
and maybe defending or a summary judgment, multiple depositions, defending and taking depositions. So yeah, it's a significant undertaking. And if you're
Mm,
not covered by insurance now, when I was working for Mr. Fink, we were doing insurance-based work. So reduced rates, but everything, typically was covered by insurance. Now, back then, as in now, we're going back 22 years, wage hour claims are not covered by insurance.
mm,
So that's a significant thing that employers need to think about is that, whoa, I have an EPLI policy, but no, yes, but an overtime claim or a regular rate claim, minimum wage claim, or some type of exemption claim based on overtime, that's not going to be covered by your policy. So employers might need to be cognizant, of that. I have another client, a fireplace supply company, and they call me from time to time because they have a new PTO policy. I want to make sure it complies, with Colorado's Healthy Families and Workplaces Act, and that they're accruing it, correctly, and they're being paid correctly, especially when they're, terminated from employment. So there's all these different things that, are involved. And I think what's attractive to me about employment law, Daniel, is that it's an ever evolving area of law. It's not static like, wills and trusts and probate. It's not static like, divorce, marital law, family law. It is a ever evolving area, and you got to keep abreast of recent developments. So that's what's nice. I mean, when I go to CLEs, I'm not just sitting there bored. I mean, I'm really paying attention. Okay, these are the new trends, and you have like someone from Littler Mendelsohn or Ogletree or Jackson Lewis or whomever, Fisher Phillips, giving a primer on what has occurred in the law in the last year or whatever it is, and now the Supreme Court has said that reverse discrimination, discrimination on the basis of race against, majority people like, white males, for example, it's not a heightened standard, to prove a prima facie case.
mm,
And that surprisingly was a unanimous verdict,
mm,
unanimous decision, written by Ketanji Brown Jackson.
mm,
So there's different areas of law, and you just got to keep abreast of all that. There's the Chevron doctrine, which was essentially eliminated by the court, and so that decision, typically what happens is courts would defer to federal agencies like the EEOC. The EEOC gives guidance on what it thinks should be, on certain areas of law. And courts would, cite that guidance as authority, in deciding a case or deciding an appellate case.
mm,
And now courts generally cannot do, I mean, they may still do that, but it doesn't have the weight of the authority that it once did.
mm.
Because, the courts, do not have to defer to federal agencies about what their interpretation of law is.
Okay. Well,
So
there's
it's
a
a
lot.
little kind of like a run-on sentence there, but I mean,
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, it's a lot of information in there, but it's
sure,
something that people need to be aware of, like the changes, what's going on, and then what they need to do in situations like this. So,
certainly.
so Greg, let's say that either an employer or an employee is looking to get some help from a lawyer, whatever their situation is. But let's say they don't know who to choose. They don't know. They don't have any referrals. They've never worked with an employment lawyer before. What
Sure.
advice would you give to this person as they do their search so that they can find that lawyer that is knowledgeable, experienced, trustworthy, and can pretty much help them get the result they're looking for?
It's a great question. I think first you would start first and foremost with experience. Someone right out of law school, they may be a great lawyer, but they're not going to have the experience of trying cases or dealing with the opposing counsel or dealing with judges, just as a practical matter. Secondly, I get a lot of work through referrals. I've just had it picked up a case the other day where this construction company was telling me that the attorney here in town, we locked horns,
Mm,
and he spoke very highly of me. So if people are talking, so ask around and ask if this lawyer, is worth his or her salt. What's their reputation? A website can tell part of the picture, Daniel, but not the entire picture.
Mhm.
And so, maybe ask your colleagues, ask, friends. And I think a lot of it, Daniel, is just simply feel. I mean, someone could be the greatest lawyer in the world, but if they don't connect
Mhm.
on a personal level, then it's all going to be for naught because there's just not going to be that connection. It's kind of like in dating. If there's a connection, there's a connection. If there's not, there's got to be some type of, the client needs to be understood and heard. The lawyer needs to feel respected, and that the client's going to allow him or her to do their job. So it's just a lot of it is there's no really science behind it. A lot of it is just asking about that individual's reputation, asking, learning about their experience and what kind of cases they've handled, what kind of matters they've practiced, what courts they practiced, before, and also just the conversation with the client himself, or herself. Okay, what do we connect? Can I help you?
Mhm.
And there have been clients that I've turned away. They've
Mhm.
had a great case, and I just, I thought to myself, I would prefer not to be joined at the hip with you, for the next year or two for various reasons. I won't get into them, but that's just the way it is. And so, but if I feel like I can work with someone, I will tell them that. I will tell them that they have a case. Of course, there's no guarantees in law, but I mean, those are the three criteria I really, would advise people looking for a lawyer. What to look for, especially an employment lawyer. Because like I said earlier, employment law is an emotional, is a personal, endeavor because talking about someone being underpaid or not getting their leave or being terminated from their job, and so it's a big deal.
Mhm. Now, I want to dive a little deeper and get your thoughts on this. So you mentioned like you want to have something that you have that connection with a lawyer that you can see yourself working with.
Sure.
Now, I'm kind of looking at it from a different perspective of there is a difference between you working with a lawyer that you like and you working with a lawyer who is very competent and can basically get the end result you're looking for. Now, hopefully, the competence is just kind of standard, like that's for every lawyer. But there is kind of this difference. So, what are your thoughts on working maybe with a lawyer that has more competence and has a higher chance of success that maybe you don't connect with as much versus a lawyer you really, really connect with, but maybe doesn't have as much competence or as high of a chance of success as a lawyer? Like, what would you do in a situation? Like, what would you advise someone in a situation like that?
Sure. Well, Daniel, I think I don't know if I disagree with your premise, is that most all lawyers are competent.
Mhm.
No.
Mhm.
I would say that a third are not competent
Mhm.
and
Wow.
they do the bare minimum
Mhm.
and they don't, treat the practice of law as something special and they cut corners. And, in the employment law field, you see it somewhat. In other areas of law, you certainly see it, um, and so that's number one. But number two, yes, I mean, you can like someone all you want, but if they can't get the job done, then of course that's a whole matter altogether. I think a lot of lawyers overpromise and underdeliver rather than the opposite.
Mhm.
I tend to do the opposite. I underpromise and overdeliver.
Mhm.
I never guarantee anything. I tell potential clients, listen, this is going to be a tough road. This is going to cost you a lot of money to defend this, and this is the reality. So, but you're here with me because you're concerned and, you don't want to handle this yourself because that would be disastrous.
Mhm.
So I think when in talking to someone for a good 10 minutes or so, you can get a sense if someone's competent or not.
Mhm.
You can kind of know whether someone knows their field of law,
Mhm.
whether whether who they say they are, or whether just can I say this on your podcast?
Yeah.
Whether they're a bullshitter or not, and see, you kind of can figure that out right away. I mean, we all have intuition. We all, if you listen to your gut, you can figure that out.
Mhm. Yeah. I
So
think that's an important thing also as far as like setting the right expectations. Because I found that when you set the right expectations, even if things don't go necessarily as well as you hoped, But if you set the right expectations, then like as long as they're on board with that, then it's a lot easier. So it sounds like that's how you set those right expectations that, hey, this is the real situation. We're not going to sugarcoat it. We're not going to dress it up and make it seem incredible and easy and all that. This is the real situation, which I'm sure has created more trust than if you did the other side, the other way.
Yes. Well, when I was with Jackson Lewis for a little over 2 years, that message was um, drummed into me, constantly. Manage client expectations.
Hmm.
You do that, and even if a client loses, they're going to know, okay, well, I knew this, and this is what to be expected. I'm fine with it. It's when you don't manage expectations and clients have unrealistic expectations, that's when they sour on you, on the firm, maybe on law altogether.
Hmm.
Because they get burned. And you see that certainly in the family law context, where lawyers ring up a bill and 50,000, 100,000, 150, to take your pick in, and the client feels like they got very little, for that expense.
Hmm.
So I want clients to feel like they've gotten value, received value from me. And almost always they do, you know. Well, they feel like it. Not always they do. Some almost always they feel like they do.
Yeah.
Some clients. I mean, it's just nature of the game. You're never going to appease or placate everybody. Someone's going to be dissatisfied. At some point. And over 24 years of practice. Now it's been 25 years of practice. Um, you're not going to please everybody.
Yeah.
But I think, like you said, managing expectations is key. If clients know that, then that certainly is the responsibility of the lawyer to make that clear.
Mhm. Okay. Very well said. Now, Greg, when it comes to your practice, what is the vision you have for your practice?
Yeah, so when I moved to Colorado, I was just kind of winging it, but really opening up your own firm. You don't know, I knew how to practice law, but I didn't know how to manage the business side of things.
Mhm.
And that was a challenge. And
Mhm.
it still remains a challenge, but much less of a challenge than it was 15 years ago or 14 years ago. You have to, manage your trust account. You got to make sure that you're dealing with that. I've had, on one occasion, had my trust account overdrawn, which goes right up to the Office of Attorney Regulation in Colorado. I have to explain myself and spend hours and hours and hours, telling them that, listen, it's not my fault. This is what happened, blah, blah, blah. But that's, you got to manage your trust account. You got to keep track of your expenses. If you have an S corp, you got to make sure that you're tracking everything for tax purposes and whatnot. So it's a significant undertaking. Now, what I would like to do and be in a position to do is to either hire someone or contract someone out, for legal work where I have more work than I know what to do with, and then I can, not be chained to my desk, for 52 weeks a year and have someone, handle some of these matters that an associate, a lower level associate can do.
Mhm.
Uh, but as an employment lawyer, I
Mhm.
know all the pitfalls that come with hiring someone. You got like unemployment insurance and
Yeah.
workers' comp insurance and payroll taxes and all the headaches. Again, you got to supervise their work. You got to kind of micromanage them a little bit.
Mhm.
And it's a pain in the neck, and all these different issues. So that's why till now I've been reluctant to do that. And I think I think all solo practitioners should have some type of legal software, billing software, trust management software, accounting software, where they could, manage everything and have it on one platform, right? Rather than dealing with like three or four different software programs. Like you have like a QuickBooks, you have something else for billing, you have something else for this, and I guess you could do that, but I mean, it's just it's to me would create more headaches.
Yeah.
So I think, I would like to, because my licenses in California are inactive, the federal and state, and there is a potentially I'd like to reactivate those licenses and do some work in California if the opportunity, presents itself.
Mhm.
Um, but that way, so I don't have to, do a pro hoc vice, application or anything like that.
Yeah.
I would have like to, maybe take 2 months off and live in the Virgin Islands or the Hawaii and, work remotely from there and,
Mhm.
or in Florida or do a snowbird type thing.
Yeah.
And do something like that. My partner has discussed, either buying or renting an RV and traveling the country for 3 months.
Mhm.
I'm not there yet.
Yeah.
I plan on working another 20 years or maybe
Yeah.
at least 15 years.
Yeah.
So, that's something I would like to do, but I think uh, people and lawyers especially, well, the reputation from the lawyers, like from the 70s and 80s, with like that they're so stressed out and they're alcoholics and they're just, work-life balance was basically non-existent because they worked themselves to death and they're divorced and they have 3 divorces and
Mhm.
whatever. I think lawyers these days are much more attuned to work-life balance, and I know Jackson Lewis was, placed a premium on that and making sure, like, yes, you get your work done. Yes, you got to come in on weekend, you got to come in on a weekend, right? Or you got to work late, you got to work late. But, your family comes first as well. And I think all firms, most should place a premium on that. For me, my kids are out of the house. My son's 25, daughter's 22. She's in the Marines. My son was a reservist in the Marine Corps. And so I don't have that concern about taking care of, a family anymore.
Mhm.
Uh, but I got to take care of, my significant other. So, and I don't want to be, working 70 hours a week, 10 years from now. No one does, right?
Mhm.
I like to go to the gym. I like to travel. I like to get outside.
Yeah.
So, but I think, for me, it's maximizing my time
Mhm.
and monetizing my time,
Mhm.
because I think a lot of attorneys these days do a lot of work for free,
Mhm.
and which is fine if you're comfortable with that. But
Mhm.
ultimately, our time is valuable, and our time is something that it's why we work. We don't work for free unless you're doing pro bono work or something like that, or you work for like some type of legal aid, outfit or something. But for the most part, you work, so you can get paid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so that's kind of like a long answer. It's kind of
Mhm.
like what I would want to do. That's like my vision for me, Daniel, kind of long term is yes, I do want to retire in 15 years. Yes, I do want to, but I want to look, you know, I want to envision what that looks like. And
Mhm.
right now, kind of the picture is kind of murky, kind of unclear.
Yeah.
But I think as time goes on, I'll have a better idea about that. But it's always good to have goals. It's always good to set goals,
Mhm.
even if you don't meet them. At least have an idea about where do I want to be. Okay,
Mhm.
March 2026. Where do I want to be in March of 2029? Where
Mhm.
do I want to be in March of 2028? How do I want to advance my legal career? How do I want to develop myself personally and develop myself, professionally? Um, a lot of it, I think for everybody, I think meditation's a great thing to take to do. Envision, sports athletes do it all the time, and
Mhm.
CEOs do it all the time. What do I envision for my life, for my law practice, and kind of meditate on that. And so I think everybody can, have have those takeaways.
Yeah. Well, having a satellite office in the Virgin Islands doesn't sound like a bad idea either.
That would, yeah, that's, I don't know if that's something that I would like that. I don't know if that's something that would materialize, but we'll
Yeah.
see.
Well, put on the goal list.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, sounds good. So, Greg, I have one last question for you, but before I ask it, I do want to point people to your website at givenslawpc.com.
I
Now,
appreciate it. Thank you.
yep, last question is, what does peace of mind mean to you?
I think peace of mind, from a professional standpoint, Daniel, is like knowing that you did your very best at the end of the day. Even if you lose, like for example, I'll go to a trial and I'll, work hard and I'll put in 80 hours, to prepare for a case. And I'll go through a trial and I'll put on witnesses and we put on our best arguments. I'll make a great closing argument and then we'll lose, you know. But I think at the end of the day, knowing that you did your very best and you can, in your conscience, you can rest assured that, okay, I can see how the jury got it that way. I can see how a judge would rule against my client, and I had a case like this a couple of years ago in a trade secret non-disclosure, non-compete case, where I thought my client had a much better winning legal argument than the other side. And we lost, but we mitigated the damage to a certain extent about, how much he had to pay. But I think in that case, I can look in the mirror and say, listen, we did the best that we can do. We presented an excellent case. And so I think peace of mind is, if you can sleep with yourself and listen to your conscience. Like there's some clients I probably would prefer not to work with, and for example, I would never, if he was living, I would never represent O.J. Simpson in a million years.
Mhm.
That's something where some other people have no problem doing it. I would have a problem doing that.
Mhm.
And so, for me, it really is just putting in the work. If you do good work and you do it well and you do it knowing, using your legal training and using your experience, but most importantly, using, uh, your experience in knowing people. Okay. How do I connect with people? And I want people to, when we're done with the case, we're done with a matter, or done with with representation, that they feel great that they hired Greg Gibbons. That Greg Gibbons is attentive, that he'll answer emails, that he'll return phone calls, that he'll be on top of their case, and that they know that I'm there for them. I'll have calls, Daniel. Sometimes people will call me and they'll pay for my consultation fee, and they just want someone to talk to. So, being a lawyer sometimes is like being an amateur, psychologist.
Mhm.
And that's, that's part of, the profession. But I think in any profession, but the legal profession, I think because we do have a fiduciary duty to our clients. We are officers of the court. We are charged to conduct ourselves professionally and, not, engage in ad hominem attacks or personal attacks against the other side or the lawyers. And these days, with email, you have to make sure that, everything that you say or do is being, recorded and transcribed and memorialized for posterity. So I think I love being a lawyer. I can't imagine doing anything else. I think the legal profession is a great profession. It's something that kids these days, they want to aspire to that. That's great. It's not for everybody, but we're there for a reason. If the world were a perfect world, Daniel, then people could resolve their disputes, and sing kumbaya.
Yeah.
That would be one thing. There'd be no need for lawyers,
Mhm.
no need. But because there are,
Mhm.
because people can't do that, that's where I step in.
Mhm.
And I'm kind of the bridge,
Mhm.
with that. So
Okay.
really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, there you go. Well, there you have it, Greg sharing his expertise. So, Greg, where can people contact you and your practice?
Sure, they can go, like you said, they can go to my website at www.givenslawpc.com. They can look me up. They can schedule a consultation. Yes, of course, I'm just, licensed to practice in Colorado right now. But they can also call me at 719-291-4353. And my email is greg@givenslawpc.com.
Awesome. Well, Greg, this is great. Thank you for coming on and thank you for sharing your knowledge.
Appreciate it, Daniel. Thank you for having me. I wish you guys the best of luck, and it sounds like you have a great firm over there. And I used to live right near where you are in Redondo Beach.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, right on off of Artesia, and on 185th. So.
Thanks for listening to the Verdict Signal podcast. Any questions? Please contact the practice directly with the contact information provided during the show. We'll see you again next time. Bye for now.